Chapter 12 of Little Lord Fauntleroy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. Little Lord Fauntleroy by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 12. A very few days after the dinner party at the castle, almost everybody in England who read the newspapers at all knew the romantic story of what had happened at Dorincourt. It made a very interesting story when it was told with all the details. There was the little American boy who had been brought to England to be Lord Fauntleroy, and who was said to be so fine and handsome a little fellow, and to have already made people fond of him. There was the old Earl, his grandfather, who was so proud of his heir. There was the pretty young mother who had never been forgiven for marrying Captain Errol. And there was the strange marriage of Bevis, the dead Lord Fauntleroy, and the strange wife, of whom no one knew anything, suddenly appearing with her son, and saying that he was the real Lord Fauntleroy and must have his rights. All these things were talked about and written about, and caused a tremendous sensation. And then there came the rumor that the Earl of Dorincourt was not satisfied with the turn affairs had taken, and would perhaps contest the claim by law, and the matter might end with a wonderful trial. There never had been such excitement before in the county in which Erleboro was situated. On market days people stood in groups and talked and wondered what would be done. The farmers' wives invited one another to tea, that they might tell one another all they had heard, and all they thought, and all they thought other people thought. They related wonderful anecdotes about the Earl's rage and his determination not to acknowledge the new Lord Fauntleroy, and his hatred of the woman who was the claimant's mother. But, of course, it was Mrs. Dibble who could tell the most, and who was more in demand than ever. "And a bad lookout it is," she said. "And if you were to ask me, ma'am, I should say that it was a judgment on him, for the way he's treated that sweet young creature as he parted from her child. For he's got that fond of him, and that set on him, and that proud of him, as he's almost drove mad by what's happened. And what's more, this new one's no lady, as his little lordship's ma is. She's a bold-faced, black-eyed thing, as Mr. Thomas says no gentleman in livery 'ud bemean himself to be gave orders by. And let her come into the house, he says, and he goes out of it. And the boy don't no more compare with the other one than nothing you could mention. And mercy knows what's going to come of it all, and where it's to end, and you might have knocked me down with a feather when Jane brought the news." In fact, there was excitement everywhere at the castle. In the library, where the Earl and Mr. Havisham sat and talked. In the servants' hall, where Mr. Thomas and the butler and the other men and women servants gossiped and exclaimed at all times of the day. And in the stables, where Wilkins went about his work in a quite depressed state of mind, and groomed the brown pony more beautifully than ever, and said mournfully to the coachman that he "never taught a young gentleman to ride as took to it more natural, or was a better plucked one than he was. He was a one as it were some pleasure to ride behind." But in the midst of all the disturbance there was one person who was quite calm and untroubled. That person was the little Lord Fauntleroy who was said not to be Lord Fauntleroy at all. When first the state of affairs had been explained to him, he had felt some little anxiousness and perplexity, it is true, but its foundation was not in baffled ambition. While the Earl told him what had happened, he had sat on a stool holding on to his knee, as he so often did when he was listening to anything interesting. And by the time the story was finished, he looked quite sober. "It makes me feel very queer," he said. "It makes me feel queer." The Earl looked at the boy in silence. It made him feel queer too, queerer than he had ever felt in his whole life. And he felt more queer still when he saw that there was a troubled expression on the small face which was usually so happy. "Will they take dearest's house from her, and her carriage?" Cedric asked in a rather unsteady, anxious little voice. "No!" said the Earl decidedly, in quite a loud voice, in fact. "They can take nothing from her." "Ah!" said Cedric, with evident relief. "Can't they?" Then he looked up at his grandfather, and there was a wistful shade in his eyes, and they looked very big and soft. "That other boy," he said rather tremulously. "He will have to be your boy now, as I was, won't he?" "No!" answered the Earl, and he said it so fiercely and loudly that Cedric quite jumped. "No?" he exclaimed in wonderment. "Won't he? I thought—" He stood up from his stool quite suddenly. "Shall I be your boy, even if I'm not going to be an earl?" he said. "Shall I be your boy just as I was before?" And his flushed little face was all alight with eagerness. How the old Earl did look at him from head to foot, to be sure! How his great shaggy brows did draw themselves together, and how queerly his deep eyes shone under them, how very queerly! "My boy!" he said, and if you'll believe it, his very voice was queer, almost shaky, and a little broken and hoarse, not at all what you would expect an earl's voice to be, though he spoke more decidedly and peremptorily even than before. "Yes, you'll be my boy as long as I live. And by George, sometimes I feel as if you were the only boy I had ever had." Cedric's face turned red to the roots of his hair. It turned red with relief and pleasure. He put both his hands deep into his pockets and looked squarely into his noble relative's eyes. "Do you?" he said. "Well, then, I don't care about the earl part at all. I don't care whether I'm an earl or not. I thought—you see, I thought the one that was going to be the earl would have to be your boy too, and I couldn't be. That was what made me feel so queer." The Earl put his hand on his shoulder and drew him nearer. "They shall take nothing from you that I can hold for you," he said, drawing his breath hard. "I won't believe yet that they can take anything from you. You were made for the place, and—well, you may fill it still. But whatever comes, you shall have all that I can give you. All." It scarcely seemed as if he were speaking to a child, there was such determination in his face and voice. It was more as if he were making a promise to himself, and perhaps he was. He had never before known how deep a hold upon him his fondness for the boy and his pride in him had taken. He had never seen his strength and good qualities and beauty as he seemed to see them now. To his obstinate nature, it seemed impossible, more than impossible, to give up what he had so set his heart upon, and he had determined that he would not give it up without a fierce struggle. Within a few days after she had seen Mr. Havisham, the woman who claimed to be Lady Fauntleroy presented herself at the castle, and brought her child with her. She was sent away. The Earl would not see her, she was told by the footman at the door. His lawyer would attend to her case. It was Thomas who gave the message, and who expressed his opinion of her freely afterward in the servants' hall. He "hoped," he said, "as he had wore livery in high famblies long enough to know a lady when he see one, and if that was a lady, he was no judge o' females." "The one at the lodge," added Thomas loftily, "'Merican or no 'Merican, she's one o' the right sort, as any gentleman 'ud recognize with all a eye. I remarked it myself to Henery when fust we called there." The woman drove away, the look on her handsome, common face half frightened, half fierce. Mr. Havisham had noticed, during his interviews with her, that though she had a passionate temper and a coarse, insolent manner, she was neither so clever nor so bold as she meant to be. She seemed sometimes to be almost overwhelmed by the position in which she had placed herself. It was as if she had not expected to meet with such opposition. "She is evidently," the lawyer said to Mrs. Errol, "a person from the lower walks of life. She is uneducated and untrained in everything, and quite unused to meeting people like ourselves on any terms of equality. She does not know what to do. Her visit to the castle quite cowed her,